Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing Clutching at Straws by Marillion.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
But before I open this video up, I just want to acknowledge the fact that we have reached and even surpassed 400 subscribers. I am so grateful. It feels like only a second ago we reached 300 subscribers and like only 2 seconds ago we were at 200. And so on and so forth. And actually right now we're at 408 subscribers. I didn't even have time to appreciate the moment because we're growing so much. So thank you so much to anyone who supports this journey of mine and of course joining this journey. You are all so good. Thank you so much. I can't believe how much we've grown. Anyway, yeah, just wanted to put that out there. In any case, here are some of my favorite bits from this album.
Sharing cigarettes with experience, with a giggling, jealous confidence. She faithfully traces his name with quick, bitten fingernails.
So we've reached this point in the series in which we meet bands for the second time, but it feels like a lot of them we haven't met in ages upon ages because it was so long ago. And well, today's band is one that it feels like eons since I reviewed them, and of course these guys are Marillion. Now the last instance in which we reviewed any Marillion album was actually all the way back in episode 88 with their newest album, the one that came out this year actually, called An Hour Before It's Dark. And while I do mean to say that this was technically the last time we reviewed them, what I meant to say in the long while since I actually reviewed Marillion was the fact that it has been quite a long while since we reviewed this original incarnation of the band, and that takes us all the way back to episode 18 with Script for a Gesture's Tear. Now that video to me is kind of a heartwarming one in some sense, because while at the moment it has only 221 views, which is not that much, and I have plenty videos with more than that, back in the day when I started this series off, this was my most popular video for a long while. And you know what? I love that video. I remember making it, I remember being very proud of it and the way I constructed that review, and I don't know, I really like it. So if any of you haven't watched that video quite already, you can go ahead and watch it. Again, I'm sorry I was only 18 days into this, journey. I didn't really know what I was doing, but hopefully my review of it still stands today. And one thing to note, if we're already here, I do believe that my rating for that album was kinda going over what I would have given it right now. I think that my method of rating albums kind of changed in that time span, and because I gave it a 9 back then, and a 9 usually means an album which I don't forget and is very memorable and of course also enjoyable, I don't believe that it stands the same test right now, so if I had to change its rating, I'd give it a comfortable 8 out of 10 right now, but I guess that doesn't really matter. Nevertheless, today's review will discuss Clutching at Straws, which is Marillion's 4th studio album and the one that's considered to be the end of the first wave of Marillion. Now, of course, when talking about this band, we must also understand that Marillion basically pioneered the second wave of prog in the 80s, showing that prog can still still remain relevant, and with plenty of hits they did nail the spot and show that prog can exist even in this new age. But that was all down to several people in the band, which were all basically spearheaded by the frontman known as Fish. And Fish, while he had a good run with Marillion, unfortunately he left the band after this album today. Clutching at Straws was the last one he had with the band, and that was of course very unfortunate, and up until today, even about 40 years later, people will always speak about Marillion as their time with Fish and as the time afterwards. But Fish didn't just leave the band out of nowhere. There was definitely a reasoning behind it, and there's actually two reasons of substance. The first one being the fact that this album, Clutching at Straws, was released and EMI Records really wanted him to release yet another one, so they put on a lot of pressure on Marillion to make yet another album, and Fish couldn't really take it, and thus he wanted to leave the band. But the reason for his declining mental state was a lot due to touring, as well as having problems with extensive use of alcohol and drugs. And all of these existential dreads that Fish was going through were actually portrayed in today's album, and this album basically features as some sort of an autobiography of Fish for what he was dealing with back at that time. So Clutching at Straws, much like Pink Floyd's The Wall, basically follows a musician, but a struggling one that has issues with success and also of course with alcohol and drugs, and basically experiencing some overall existential dread. And much like the peculiar name Pink given in The Wall, today's protagonist is called Torch. Now from this you can understand that this is a concept album, and assessing a concept album to me is one of the more fun tasks that I have to do on this list, because I really like digging in and actually seeing how far does the concept go and how well I can enjoy it. And usually when I have to review a concept album, the first thing I really think about is how well the concept is portrayed. Does it tell a story? Can I understand that story? And if it doesn't tell a story, does it portray a singular or multiple ideas in a way that's comprehensible by the listener? And well, in this album's case, I do feel like it has me in some mixed feelings. Much like the album An Hour Before It's Dark, this one also has some brilliant lyrics and probably some of the more vivid lyrics we've seen on Marillion's entire discography. And the way that the lyrics are written and executed in this album really makes you feel like you're inside Torch's shoes, so much that it actually takes the listener's sympathy for him and turns it into genuine empathy. But while a good basis for the character and a story exists on here, I do believe that the story overall is pretty much lacking. Now, this is probably a consequence of me not really knowing a lot about this album going into it, but in some sense I really don't like doing that much research before going into an album, because I do believe that it takes some of the surprise away from me. So I kind of got into this one knowing the general idea about it, but not too much when it comes to the specifics. But in my personal view of this album, it seems like it opens up with giving us an exposition about Torch, who he is. He's a struggling musician, he has a lot of problems with himself and with the world, and he has a drug problem and an alcohol problem. And that's fine and all, but then you realize that when getting towards the end of this album, the same motive still exists. It doesn't really seem like he's made any progress in that time, and honestly to me it sounded like he was at the same exact mental state in the beginning and towards the end. Now the reason I'm saying towards the end is because the last song on here kind of really changes up the mood and shows us that there is actually a happy ending to the story, but unfortunately I really don't know what the real story is. And again, the way I know that this story ends happily is because the last track on here is called The Last Straw, Happy Ending. And to be honest, I feel like this album had a lot of potential when it comes to the narrative on it, which was kind of missed on here. I do feel like there is an interesting baseline, there is an interesting story to be told, but I just don't feel like there was much to really experience when it comes to the narrative. But as a whole, I do believe that it doesn't really matter that much, because of course we've come here for the music itself. But before I go ahead and speak about that, I just want to point out one excellent song on here, which is Warm Wet Circles, which is a great track, which I love mainly for its lyrics actually. It has such a beautiful way of showing the things that we need in order to feel good with ourselves and how they change throughout life, once being a mother's kiss and at the second moment being the warm and wet circle that is remaining after you take off a glass of beer from the bar. It's just marvelous writing. I really love that one. I came back to it multiple times just to open the lyrics up and read along because it's so good, and I do believe that if we need to talk about Fish's legacy, this is probably the one we're gonna remember. But when it comes to my favorite song from this album, I do believe I have to go a bit basic and choose the track Incommunicado. Now, Incommunicado was actually released as a single, and for a good reason, honestly. It is really fun, it is really getting your body moving, it is just so nice to listen to, and I can definitely understand why people up until today still listen to this one with much joy. But when it comes to the rest of this album, I will have to admit I kind of just forgot everything that it had to do with anything, because I do feel like Marillion, since starting in 1983 with their debut album, kind of just found their own way, which would, you know, usually be a very good thing for a band to find their own way, because at the beginning, let's face it, they were just kind of a Genesis copycat band. And now that they found their own way, they did manage to get to some really successful heights and people loved them back in the day, and that's all good and all, but I do believe like their way of doing prog was definitely not what I enjoy that much, and thus I'll say that I much preferred Script for a Gesture's Tear than today's album because, well, it's not really my cup of prog. And listening to this album today, I start realizing how neo-prog that we know nowadays basically developed. From the beginning with Script for a Gesture's Tear to this one, we can already start seeing the shift towards contemporary music and appreciation that will later on lead to some of the stalest and lackluster albums that would call themselves prog in a very shameless manner. So again, Clutching at Straws is not a bad album. It's actually pretty good, but I do believe that it lacks on the two fronts, being the musical and the narrative one. So, you know, we'll have to take it as it is. So the concept of how this album cover should look was proposed by Fish himself. Of course, this being his sort of memoir album that he wanted to tell his own story on, I can definitely see why he wanted the cover to look in a certain way. But for that task, they of course inquired the person who was in charge of making all the Marillion covers up until this point, and that's of course no other than Mark Wilkinson. And well, it doesn't really take a genius to look at this cover and realize that it has something lacking as compared to all the three covers that came before it. And I do believe that the answer to what's actually lacking is very much simple. It lacks color. It has a black background that really doesn't look reminiscent of anything Marillion up to this point, and the reasoning for this one looking sort of half-assed is because this cover is actually an unfinished work of art. You see, by Wilkinson's own admission, EMI Records were struggling with this one. They gave him a limited time frame to actually create this cover art, and they were putting a bunch of pressure on him to finish it, a thing that would ultimately not help him do the task as best as he could. So while we do get the important aspects of this drawing, of course all being in a bar as symbolizing the alcoholism that is portrayed on here, or the fact that Torch, the main character, has some connection to the gesture in Script for a Gesture's Tear, and of course the fact that there are multiple people chosen by Fish himself that have influenced him, a la Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band's cover by the Beatles. But unfortunately, we don't really get to see the full image that was envisioned in Wilkinson's head, and that's just a bummer, honestly. I don't know what was at stake back in the day, but I can already say that honestly a cover is something that goes with an album into infinity, eternity. It will always symbolize an album, and just thinking about the fact that this could have been something much better and much better looking, I know, it's just a shame. And on a personal note, I would have liked this cover if it had more to it, if it had more color, if it had more personality. It does look unfinished to me, and that's just a shame. So yeah, this is definitely not a bad album. It's just one that it's really hard for me to care for all that much, so unfortunately it will be getting a lesser rating than the last two, and that's a rating of 7 out of 10. But yeah, that's about it guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to Leg End by Henry Cow. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wadham, Rist of Kings and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it guys. Have a wonderful day and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye guys.